This podcast contains adult content and discussions of first-time sexual experiences. Listener discretion is advised. Some stories may include themes that are sensitive or triggering for some audiences. There's something about the number 3 that changes everything. Two people can disappear into each other. 3? 3 introduces comparison, curiosity, chaos, sometimes jealousy, sometimes freedom, sometimes a story you laugh about forever, and sometimes one you never speak about again. Welcome to Sexual Encounters. I'm MaryJane. Today's episode is called Three's Company and More, because today we're talking about first-time experiences with more than one partner, whether it's a threesome, a throuple, an open dynamic, or simply finding yourself emotionally or physically entangled with multiple people at once. Was it exciting? Was it awkward? Unexpectedly intimate? Emotionally overwhelming? Did everyone actually know what was happening? Today's conversation explores desire, communication, fantasy, boundaries, vulnerability, and the reality of navigating intimacy when more than 2 people enter the picture. And honestly, sometimes the emotional logistics are harder than the sexual ones. In this episode, I'm joined by not 1, not 2, but 3 guests. Dr. Markie, renowned award-winning sexologist and now a regular on the podcast. Dr. Iantaffi, an award-winning author, independent scholar, licensed marriage and family therapist, and former editor-in-chief of the Journal of Sexual and Relationship Therapy. Their work explores gender, disability, sexuality, relationships, and trauma. And Dr. Mallory, an assistant professor of human development at Ohio State University, whose research focuses on the health and well-being of LGBTQ+ youth and adults, as well as the emotional, relational, and sexual well-being of individuals and couples. Some listeners may also remember him from our episode on first LGBTQ+ experiences. Welcome, everyone. This already feels appropriately crowded.
Hey.
So I feel like threesomes and group dynamics are often treated like this ultimate fantasy in pop culture, something spontaneous, sexy, effortless, and emotionally uncomplicated. But I imagine that the reality can be much messier. So I want to start here. What do people most misunderstand about first-time group experiences?
What a great question, MaryJane. I think that there is a lot that sometimes people misunderstand. I think some of my first thoughts is, what is the context, right? Is the threesome with people you already know or with people you just met at a party, for example? And so I think there is a misunderstanding, first of all, of how those things can happen, how it can be negotiated, right? Because like you said, in popular culture, it always looks easeful and spontaneous and sexy. And the reality is that the more bodies, more boundaries, more things to talk about, more sensory input. There is so much that's happening, right? I think there are a lot of things that people can misunderstand about first group experiences, especially because they can be so taboo that they're not talked about very much, right? And so most people are not really ready to go into a group experience unless they maybe have a kind of sexuality as a special interest and have really thought about it beforehand. But I think the reality is that a lot of people stumble into those experiences and kind of they learn as they go. I don't know. What do you think, Alan? Those are just my first thoughts.
I guess what my thought about this when I was first thinking about first time misunderstandings, I think the two biggest ones are logistics, organizing like what actually happens and thinking about that ahead of time, and sort of also like why everybody's there. Because a lot of times not everybody's there for the same reason. But I think more so the logistics part that I'd speak to is just even simple things about how do you transition from just hanging out to starting to actually do fun things together. I think a lot of times I've had experience where people kind of get stuck in the like, okay, we're hanging out, but how do we actually transition into the fun, sexy part of this experience? And I think some logistics like those, even like how does it end, and like are there going to be breaks? All those sorts of things that sometimes get overlooked and get lost in the kind of fantasy of it all, of it just like it's going to be this magical thing that just works perfectly just because everybody's there.
Yeah, I think all of what you've both said are definitely things that people don't realize going into it. And that does get in the way of the like fantasy versus the reality dynamic that happens for people. And the difficulty is there's hardly any research on threesomes. And because there's hardly no research, and it's also not something that's really taught. Right. So again, I know I always sound like a broken record on here, but a lot of this is lack of education and lack of role modeling. So I think that's a big part of it. Then I think there are two parts that really go into context and logistics, which you both mentioned. Communications just before, during, and after, right? Alan, your point of how do you get it started? Well, I mean, we could borrow from BDSM kink and have a conversation about consent and also about a stoplight method and also about what's our safe word as a dynamic, right? That's a before and a during, but you also have to consider what does this mean after? And for some people, there isn't any big trauma. In fact, it meets their, experience or it's fantastic. But for other people, there can be a fallout from a threesome. And so people definitely need to talk about the after. And for example of context, you don't know if the people you're doing a threesome with are consenting to some sort of three-way dynamic. You don't know really what it means to them and to each other per se, meaning, is this a kink BDSM thing? Someone's like, this is my kink, right? Like, I really like group sex and this is what I want to do. But for someone else, it might be a part of their relational orientation. It might be that you are in a primary dyadic couple relationship and you want to invite a third person into that relationship. And that is not necessarily a BDSM kink thing. And so having that conversation too, like what does this mean for people, I think is really important. But again, where's the education?
I'm curious, who initiates the idea first? I mean, you've mentioned BDSM kink. You've mentioned that maybe it's a relational thing. Do people usually do it because they're asking for novelty, validation, exploration, connection, permission, or maybe just boredom?
I can share a little bit. Again, there's very little research on this, but one study, and this is from the Journal of Sex Positivity, and this was by Morris et al. In 2016, and they looked at, and here we go, it's almost always undergraduates somewhere, right? So this
Yeah.
is about 200 undergrad students in a large southeastern university. So that's really interesting too. But what they found was for most people, at least in this study, it was more about curiosity than anything else. That was the main motivator. And a lot of these were first times, literal first times in threesomes. The other big one was it just happened. Like there really wasn't some sort of plan per se going into it. What was interesting too about this group for the study was they also asked people who was the most common persons, like people involved with each other. Was it strangers? Was it a triadic polyamorous relationship? What was the nature of it? And most of the time it was a dyad and it was an acquaintance of both that they invited into it. And so that brings up other feelings, at least, from my point of view as someone who's bisexual. Sometimes what happens is couples will approach you and they want what's called a unicorn, which is more on I think, the BDSM kink side and less on like you're a part of this relational dynamic with us. And for me, and I'm not going to speak certainly for all bisexual people, right? That feels very objectifying. And I don't enjoy that. But other people might have a very different relationship with that part. And then finally, in that study, they also asked what was the effect on the relationships. And the majority of people said it had no effect, just no effect. It wasn't negative. It wasn't necessarily positive. It just didn't have an effect.
I feel like the research really resonates with my experience, both in community and as a sex therapist. I think that the first time, especially, curiosity is such a huge driver. Of course, how could it not be? And I think it's also because it's such a trope in a lot of porn or sexually explicit media or movies, right? So there is something kind of attractive because it is such a kind of popular culture trope. And so I'm not surprised that curiosity is such a big driver. I do think there is something to be said about who is seeking who and for what purpose, right? As somebody who's both bi and trans, I think there can be a lot of fetishizing of both of those identities. And so, which is fine if it's consensual, to be completely honest, right? From a kink perspective, I'm like, okay, if we're all agreeing that there is a fetishistic element to this connection, fine, and I'm consenting to it. But sometimes it doesn't feel consensual. It's more of a undercurrent, and I think that creates more problems. But I think in terms of who initiates, I think it can go in so many different directions. But I think that it is not unusual for a dyad, so what normally we would say a couple, to initiate a threesome, unless there is already a context like a sex party or a play party where maybe things are happening more organically. But if it's kind of in the privacy of somebody's home, generally it's usually initiated by a couple, in my experience, of some kind, right? They may be monogamous, non-monogamous, but that I would very much agree, like that the literature reflects kind of what I've seen happen both in community with clients and in my own life.
I'd agree with everything that everyone said so far. It does sort of vary who initiates it. I think the context matters a lot. I think if you're in a particular setting where that's something that can happen, it can be initiated in lots of different ways. To Alex's point, there are a lot of times it is couples that initiate it, and maybe there's something about there being a couple dynamic that makes it a little easier to approach somebody about that. But I also think there can be some fluidity in that, myself being non-monogamous and bisexual. I feel like there have been lots of situations where it's been initiated I've initiated, or my partner's initiated, or my partner and somebody else initiated and then asked me. So I think it just sort of depends too on like what the dynamic between everyone involved is going to be. But I do think the general trends of who initiates it are pretty accurate.
And this kind of segues into one of the myths that I would like us to tackle, the myth that everyone is equally into it. I think sometimes people assume everyone entered into the situation with the exact same comfort level and expectation, but emotionally, that may not always be true. How do power dynamics, people pleasing, or insecurity in first-time group experiences?
I think that's a great question. I think a great starting point with this is kind of where we left off about often couples being the people that initiate the group plays. There's sometimes inherently a power dynamic with a couple inviting a third person in. And they can be challenging too, because if you're the third person being invited and you have no idea sometimes what the nature of the relationship with the couple is, it could be something they both agreed to mutually to do, or it could be something that one person wants more than the other. And it's always very awkward when you find that out in the middle of a threesome or group play. Sometimes there's also a dynamic, I think, that I've kind of encountered a lot too, which I think it blends kind of the emotional and power dynamic too, is that if you don't know the people that you're doing this with very well, you don't know what some expectations are. I think more than once I've been surprised, not necessarily in a bad way, that maybe there was like a guy that was more interested in doing stuff with a guy that wasn't explicitly said ahead of time. And so like, it's fine, but it's sort of nice to know things like that ahead of time to kind of know what the expectations are. There also can be interesting dynamics when maybe not everybody in a dynamic is interested in playing with everybody, and that kind of changes what's possibility for that experience. And so I think just from a perspective, even knowing what people are interested in and why everybody's there brings up a lot of those power dynamics. And then, of course, I think, especially when it's a new group dynamic, I think, especially if people are new to it, they don't necessarily know how they're going to feel about potentially seeing their partner with somebody else or potentially their own experience about being seen by other people. And so there's a lot of kind of aspects of things that can bring up a lot of emotions that if you haven't really talked through it or thought through it, and it's a new experience with new people in a new context, a lot of those things come up. And again, to Dr. Twist's point earlier, that's where the consent and the communication early on can help avoid some of that. But a lot of times these dynamics are somewhat spontaneous too, so those conversations don't always happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of those points make sense. If I was going to try to sort of categorize the issue around power, there's always power in any room that you're in. It's just whether or not it's going to be power over or it's going to be shared power and empowerment. And so, right out of the gate, the genders of the people in the room matter, right? I mean, historically, cis men have more power in a room than other people unless you now start factoring in other things like sexual orientation and you factor in race and so on and so forth. And so I think, and age, never forget age, because we've talked about that before too. And as somebody who is oftentimes one of the oldest people in a relational dynamic and an intimate dynamic, power has to be discussed, I believe, just inherently because of that. And so I think part of it is we're not very good at talking about power. And it would be helpful if we have experiences that give us opportunities to do that in meaningful ways. And so I would encourage people to discuss that. And here's the other thing, whatever everyone is equally into it means that might not ever be the case in anything really, but there might be parts of stuff that people are into, like Alan mentioned, the idea that if it's two guys that are involved in this and one person has more ideas about similar gender intimacy, that can be a really empowering experience, but it needs to be discussed. That can be really great. And then, but it might not be. One person might be like, well, I've done this a million times. So yeah, that's fine. We can do something, but I'm not necessarily going to have as much pleasure out of it per se as you because it's not my first time in this way. So there can even be power dynamics around some people might have already had group dynamics and other people have not. And then we get back to like, do you have to become a teacher? No, it's not necessarily about that unless that's a role you want to play.
Yeah, I love everything that you both said. And I was thinking about how where it gets kind of a little messy is if there is a hidden agenda, so somebody's not communicating what they really want. And because the topic of group sex is so taboo, and there isn't the education, like you said, right? There are not a lot of role models. People tend not to talk as openly about group experiences because there could be embarrassment, taboo, all of those kind of things. Then there could be secret agendas, right, in air quotes. So, for example, if somebody wants to have a threesome because actually they're interested in another person and they see that as an entry point to a relationship with that person potentially, or if somebody wants to have a threesome to explore their sexuality and maybe they've never had experiences with the same gender before or with the opposite gender, but they feel embarrassed to talk about it and they're not saying it, then it creates a really weird vibe, to be honest. And you're like, something is going on and I can't put my finger on it. And then eventually you usually do. You know what I mean? It's like something that I can't like see, touch, smell is going on. And usually it's power and unspoken desire or unspoken boundaries, because sometimes also people don't know what a boundary is until they trip on it, right? Maybe they're like, sure, the idea seems fun. And then they're like, I hadn't really thought this through. And so I think that's when it can get real messy. But I want to go back to the original myth that everybody's equally into it. I think that's a myth about sex generally. It's actually pretty rare, I think, to be in a moment where the stars align and we're all equally into this sexual moment. It doesn't matter if it's 2 people, if it's 3 people, you know, if it's 4 people, if it's 10 people. It's hard for, I don't know, I like group sex. I was like, 10 people. People have seen short bus, right? Like you can have a lot of people during a group sex moment. like at a party or something, right? But the fact is that the reality is that not everybody is going to be into it in the same way in that moment. And also that desire ebbs and flow. Maybe you're really aroused at the beginning and then you're like, I'm kind of done. And your arousal kind of declines. Maybe there's neurodivergence. And so you need more stimuli. That's the other thing. Sometimes it's just more people, more sensory stimuli can feel really good. And so I think that generally it's pretty rare that people are exactly equally into a thing when they're doing it. And it's a dance, right? Like there are moments that are like, oh, we feel so in sync. And it feels just like when you dance with a partner, it feels like the partnership is working really well. And then moments where it's a little bit more clunky, I think.
So, does adding more people lessen the intimacy? And this is possibly another myth that adding more people automatically makes sex less emotional, less meaningful, less vulnerable. I wonder if sometimes the opposite happens. Can group experiences unexpectedly intensify emotional vulnerability and attachment?
Yeah, I can get us started on this one because it's kind of a good segue in a way from what we were saying earlier about people being equally into it or not. I think it depends. I think that you can have casual sex, even with strangers, that is incredibly intimate if people are really present and in the moment and communicative and vulnerable and open. And you can have incredibly not connected or intimate sex with somebody you've known for a long time if they're shut down or they're relying on business as usual. I worked with a lot of long-term couples where there is such a falling back on a sexual script that is kind of decided on, and where actually it's not very intimate, it's almost mechanical. Sometimes it can almost feel like maintenance sex, right, in some relationship. So I don't think it's really about the number of the people. I think it's about the willingness to be vulnerable and communicative that creates the intimacy. And even personally, I can think of incredibly intimate moments, both in terms of group sex, but also in terms of with people I didn't know very well or didn't know at all, and not so intimate moments with people I knew really well. And so for me, what's important generally, but especially during sex, is are you present? Are you here? Are you really in this moment with the people in the room? Are you willing to be open and vulnerable and communicative or not? Because that is the doorway to intimacy. Or is this just kind of like a sensory experience where there is not a lot of emotional availability or presence? And then it feels a little more mechanical, which could still be fun, but it's definitely not the most connected experience or most intimate experience.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think partly because threesomes, group sex are so fantasized about, I think there's this illusion that this whole different thing, and it is novel for a lot of people. And so maybe the first handful of times you do it, the novelty does kind of intensify the experience. But I think, like all sex, if you're having sex and you're doing it frequently and with the same people or same person, you're going to have a variety of experiences in terms of the emotional intensity and the type of sex that it looks like. I think some places that it can intensify the emotional intensity potentially is there is a level of connectivity that can be hard to achieve with just one other person. I think there's different types of emotional intensity, but I think there is vulnerability in terms of how you're being perceived by two people and the kind of dynamics that you might get into with two people versus one person, which gets to other things. But I think that also can change dynamics in a lot of ways. There's also experiences where it feels very mechanical, where maybe it's the equivalent of relationship sex for people that have multiple partners, but it can become like relationship sex where it's like it's enjoyable, it's good, but you've kind of done these moves before, you've done this before, and you kind of know what to expect. And it's a good time, but you're not doing anything incredibly new or innovative. So I think it runs the gamut. So I definitely think that it's a myth that it's less intimate. I think it runs the gamut from very intimate to mechanical, just like any other type of sex can.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all of what my colleagues, friends, wonderful humans have already shared. I will just share, and I appreciate people's vulnerability, of course. One of my most intimate human experiences, and I am not a human that in general likes penetrative group dynamics. Like, I don't. And this is not a penetrative example. my friends and I in college, there was probably about 6 or 7 of us, and we were all hanging out in one of the dorms for some reason, like college students do. And we were laying on the floor on pillows and stuff, and we all just literally started holding hands and just holding each other and just touching each other and just being intimate that way. Our clothes were completely on. We were not using uh, any sort of altering substances at all. There was no necessary discussion around this, except we were just talking and hanging out and being this way. If you've seen the series Pluribus, it's pretty much how they
Mhm.
sleep. It's pretty much how they sleep. And it was literally one of the most comforting, vulnerable, intimate human encounters I've ever had in my life. And I'm not sure I would ever do that again. But we have a lot of stereotypes about what multi-dynamics look like, and it isn't always penetrative. Sometimes it's kink BDSM. Sometimes it really is just cuddle buddies. And that's a really intimate experience too. Because we have folks that are also asexual. And these are still intimate encounters and still
Mhm.
involve a deep form of intimacy.
And in fact, I saw a TikTok video of this concept of cuddle buddies where people come together and they are hugging and just laying down and touching each other, which I found very interesting. But
Yeah, and this is long before TikTok. I
Yeah.
mean, this is like the 90s, right? So, I mean, we barely had the internet, and it was like a cuddle puddle, basically.
you all mentioned aspects of the hidden agenda, right? If somebody maybe is interested in one party versus the other, and depending on who initiated it, or maybe during the whole thing, one is more interested in one thing versus the other, which takes us to the myth around jealousy, that if you're jealous, it means it's failure, right? Proof that you can't handle non-traditional dynamics. But jealousy is also a human thing that a lot of us go through. So, how should people think about jealousy, comparison, and emotional discomfort in these experiences?
Yeah, jealousy is always a thing for people. Not always. Some people manage this and have different feelings. But I do think jealousy is a normal way to feel, period. Not just about intimacy and sexual engagement, but across life people feel that way. It's a normal way to feel, and shame I don't think helps anyone. It also doesn't mean that something's wrong per se, or that you've done something wrong, or your partner has necessarily done something wrong, because you could have planned this all out. You could follow each other's boundaries, safe words, and whatever, and still not understand how you're going to feel in the moment or after. Because the jealousy can show up, yes, in real time, but sometimes it's afterwards, right? And so those are all things that need to be just thought about, right? And then discussed as needed. The other side of this is, though, compersion. And compersion is the opposite of jealousy. And that's that feeling of, and I like to use the example when I'm working with people, like, you know how you have a best friend? I'm sure everybody in this room has at least one best friend. You might even have more than one best friend. I know I do. And you know how exciting it is when your best friends meet for the first time and you're like, I feel so much love right now, and they love each other and I love them and it's great. That's compersion. And sometimes the same thing happens when you have multi intimacy dynamics that happen. What the research shows, and you knew I'd come back here at some point, there was a very recent study that was actually done based out of Minnesota. So, this study was done by Thompson et al. In 2026 and was published in the Journal of Sexual and Relationship Therapy, which Alex was the editor in chief of, and I'm currently the editor in chief of. And they looked at, this wasn't just college students, but it was a small sample across the US of 116 adults. And they basically asked them about what are the considerations that need to be addressed before you enter threesomes. And they found you have to negotiate things like, number one thing was jealousy, and boundaries. That was literally the most common theme in this sample, and this question really speaks to that. The other common one after that was exploring similar sex and differing sexual behaviors. That was definitely the next one. And the third one was the desire to engage in kink, BDSM activities. And those were the three things this group of people really were like, those things need to be negotiated, discussed. Those are the boundaries. It has to be a partner discussions. Like, it needs to all be a part of it. See how it's sounding like a lot of work? Anyway.
It is a lot of work. That's the thing. It's like, not only is it a lot of work, it's also like you're going into the unknown in a lot of ways. I think multiple times we've mentioned kind of sometimes you don't know how you're going to feel until you're doing the thing or until you're in the situation, especially because we're talking about first times. I think it is so important to think about the uncertainty piece. There is this idea by Merleau-Ponty that talks about embodied cognition, that you can do some thinking ahead, you can imagine, but you actually are not going to know until you are in the situation or until you're doing the thing or until you have the experience. And so I think that piece of embodied cognition applies here, especially for first time kind of group experiences or threesome. You're not going to know how you're going to feel until you're in the situation, right? And jealousy absolutely comes into play. And I've been non-monogamous for over a quarter of a century, which makes me feel really old. But, for 26 plus year, I'm going into my 27th year of being non-monogamous. And I definitely experienced jealousy. And it's been interesting to see the discourse around jealousy changing in non-monogamy circles too. It used to be really taboo. It was almost like enforced compersion, right? You had to feel compersion and joy because otherwise you were not evolved, in air quotes. And I think now we come back full circle to accepting each other's humanity and our own humanity and having compassion for that. And I think that jealousy can really be this invitation to get to know yourself, because jealousy is not really about what's happening with other people. It's about our own needs. Are there needs that are not getting met? Is there some inequality in the interaction that's happening? And it can be provoked by something real that's happening. There can be some imbalance sometimes in group dynamics or in threesomes, and that can trigger certain feelings. Or it could come from a more internal experience of inadequacy, for example. And I think that if you have things that you haven't dealt with, group experiences or non-monogamy are going to bring it up. Like if you have relational shit, or can we swear on this? I was like, we're talking about sex, so I assume so. But if you have relational stuff that you haven't dealt with, it's going to come up, right? So if you have body image issues, and I say this with a lot of compassion as somebody who has a lot of body image issues. And so if you have body image issues and you haven't fully dealt with it, feelings are going to come up. And then it's like, do you have the tools to notice and be like, I'm going to look at this later? Or is it going to kind of spew all over the moment and kind of affect it? Or a mixture of both, because we're just humans. But I think that jealousy happens. It's good to talk about it, but also you can't really avoid it. Like, I really appreciate that the research brings up, talk about it ahead of time. But especially if it's your first time, you're not going to know how you're going to feel. You might imagine that you're going to feel all this compersion, and then you might be shocked about how jealous you feel. Or you might imagine that you're going to feel jealous and actually feel pretty chill about it. There are so many different possibilities. But I think that just being open to the fact that feelings are going to come up, and is there going to be availability afterwards to take care of ourselves and each other? I think that commitment to care is also really important in those kind of interactions.
So I have to agree with everything that Alex and Markie have said. I think they have really done a good job kind of exploring this topic. I don't know how I have a ton to add. I think the two things that I was thinking about is kind of building out the last thing that Alex said is about like kind of this idea of care. Because I do think you have a few people, two people go into a dynamic, one person comes out feeling great, the other person might not. And being able to put aside your own euphoria, excitement, happiness about the experience to take care of the other person is important. And I think in non-monogamy, I think the principles I always think about is always handle situations with care, because inevitably you're going to be on the other side of that at some point when you're in group dynamics. And so keeping that in mind when you're handling those situations around jealousy and I combine jealousy and compersion. Jealousy, emotional discomfort. But the compersion part is really interesting, and I think it shows up in lots of different ways, and it's kind of fun when that does happen, because that is like kind of like I don't know if it's the ideal experience, but it is like it's a fun experience when you're able to experience that in a group dynamic. And I think the other part of it I was thinking about, again, bringing it back to context, is like the emotional discomfort part in threesomes and group dynamics is just, there's so many moving pieces that inevitably you're not going to be able to predict what it is, the thing that's going to potentially make you jealous or the thing that you're going to be really into. And I think just keeping that in mind, I think one of the really basic things that if it's not your first time, you don't really think about, is even just the idea of how infrequently we actually get to see people having sex in real life, and how that in and of itself can be kind of a shocking thing and might bring up feelings about yourself or your partner or the dynamic that you're in that you might not anticipate. And so I think that's one thing that, especially if it's the first time in a group dynamic or a threesome, I think can kind of be sort of an unexpected source of these feelings, because seeing people have sex in person is very different than watching porn. So, in some ways more than others. So I think that's what I would add.
So speaking about the unpredictability of it all, what are some of the awkward, funny, and unexpected human realities that people encounter that nobody talks about?
Man, so many. Where to start? I think to really get into logistics, I think the two that immediately come to mind is, one, make sure you have enough, whatever kind of sex you're having, enough protection that's needed for everybody, because that's never fun if you run out of condoms or whatever you're using. And having conversations too about what protection looks like, since you're going to be having sex with potentially having sex and doing sexual things with different people. The other one I think too is, I don't know why my brain went right to hygiene, but I think the one thing people don't think about a lot, especially if you're new to threesomes or group dynamics, is you might be kissing a lot of different people. Your mouths might be on different parts of different people's bodies, and are you okay with that? And what's that experience for you? And different people feel differently about that. But I think those are some of the initial thoughts that I had about this. But I think about other things like hydration, making sure there's like accessible water, thinking about things about where's the bathroom at in case there needs to be a break or something like that. I think conversations about whether it's aftercare or after the threesome or group play, like how's everybody take care of each other after the fact? Is it just kind of like everybody gets up and leaves, or are we hanging out, relaxing, spending time together? Is one of those things. I think from a visual perspective, I'm kind of going through the senses in my head. It's just like feeling comfortable being seen by multiple people. If that's not something that's new to you, having a reaction that maybe you're used to having in private that now somebody else might be seeing for the first time, and if you're okay with that. Yeah, things like that. No funny stories are coming to mind right now, but there are lots of things that I think I could go on about practicality. But if you're doing kink stuff, using toys, things like that, having them set up and accessible so you can get to them in a way that fits the scene. But I could keep going. But I think there's lots to say.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I also think, and I know your straight go to sexual health is so important though, because we hadn't really talked about the sexual health component. And also testing, right? Like, not only are we going to do barriers, what kind of barriers? Are we not going to do barriers? What does that look like? Whatever it is. Lube. Oh my God, please have lube, no matter what the situation. And then what's testing going to look like? Are we all going to do that as a group, or do we just share individually? And then what does that look like? Substance use, checking in on what consent looks like around substances, what that means. From a very extreme point of view, most people would say don't use any mind altering substances in these dynamics. But regardless, you do want to talk about it, because much like everything else we've talked about, you don't want to make assumptions about the people and their state of being per se. So yeah, I would actually touch on those sexual health dynamics as well, for sure.
Absolutely. When it comes to substances, I think it's also important to think about alcohol as a substance. I think often people only think about substances
100%.
as like, right, as like drugs. Actually, alcohol is also a substance that kind of changes our inhibition, it changes our boundaries. And so it's so important to kind of consider all of that. But, also, I love so much of what you both said. When you started talking about hygiene, Alan, I was like, yes, I'm a germaphobe. So I was like, yes, I love talking about hygiene because I'm going to notice if
Same.
somebody has put something in somebody else's, and that I'm like, hang on a minute, where has this been? You know, whether it's a body part or a toy or, anything like that. And so I think that it's so important to talk about comfort, because also we have different levels of comfort when it comes to hygiene. And also we have different levels of vulnerability. As somebody who has more autoimmune issues, I'm more vulnerable than other people, right? So sometimes people are like, I just have a cold, right? It's nothing. But something that's nothing, in air quotes, for somebody might put me out of commission for like 2 weeks. So it's not even just like a gene in terms of toys and fluids. It's also like, hey, are we all kind of in agreement in terms of where we are in terms of our health status right now, exposure, there's just so many things to talk about. Those are not sexy, in air quotes, conversation, but they really enable then the moment to be way sexier, I think, for a lot of people. I think a lot of people want to bypass the hard stuff, but actually it's not bypassing the hard stuff that makes the group sex way more fun. Because if you have talked about the hard stuff like testing, sexual health, aftercare, then you're going to be so much more relaxed. Because the reality is that with threesomes, with group sex, there is such a vulnerability. Alan, I think you said it so beautifully. It's like you're going to be visible to more people in a moment that's usually very private. And it might be people that you don't have deep and meaningful connections with either. So there is a certain level of leaning into vulnerability and trust that's not going to be used or weaponized against you later. And also knowing that it might be. And so there's also an owning of our own sexuality, I think, when we choose. I think I was thinking about this piece of vulnerability, but also owning our own sexuality, being confident, so that if somebody later on does weaponize, like, oh, I've seen you in that sexual situation. If you have a lot of shame about your own sexuality and participating in group sex, that can be even more hurtful. And so I always say to people, think ahead about the consequences, because you're not going to be in the same level of intimacy with everybody involved. And so things might come out that you would rather keep private. And is that okay if that happens? Because the more people you add to the mix, the more opportunity for that vulnerability, to get hurt, really. And the last thing that I was thinking about, it's much more like practical. I think that we don't often realize it's how much more sensory there is with more people. So I remember participating in my first self-pleasure, so kind of masturbation circle. And especially because it was a mixed gender group too, there was so much smell that, like the intensity of the smell, and I'm very sensitive to smell, is something that I could not have predicted, to be completely honest. And I would much rather talk about my experiences than clients' experiences, of course, because for respect. But for me, I was like, whoa, I hadn't thought about the smell multiplied. If you have 10 bodies in a room masturbating in various ways, there is going to be more smell. There is going to be more sound. And so even just the sensory input, right? If you are neurodivergent and you're really sensitive to lighting, to sound, to smell, that is something that you might want to feel ready for. How do you take care of yourself? Are you going to use loops to diminish the sound if that's something that you need? Are you going to feel able to advocate for yourself in terms of lighting and things like that? And then the last thing I'll say about the neurodivergence piece is that some of us take a little bit longer to know how we feel about a situation. And so there needs to be aftercare almost after the aftercare, because sometimes we might be hanging out and everything is fine. And I say this as somebody who experiences myself. And then sometimes it's like 2 days later, I'm like, oh, I have a feeling that I didn't recognize in the moment, but now I can see it and I can understand it and I can communicate it. Maybe I felt it on some level, but I couldn't understand it or communicate it in that moment. And it takes me a little bit longer. It takes me being able to retreat into myself before I can communicate it. And so to make space for that and not see it as something that's undermining the beauty of the moment. The moment can still be beautiful and expansive or challenging or funny or whatever the moment is, but just know the feelings sometimes come up later and that's okay. And I think that's another piece that it's so useful to talk about, like what are our access needs in terms of neurodivergence, physicality, emotionally, like we all have access needs. And I think that we often don't talk about it. We assume we all have the same baseline or the same way of processing the world, but we don't.
You guys have touched on the emotions that may appear, the attachment issues, insecurities, and connections. So, what other surprises do these kind of experiences bring forth?
Such a great question. This is almost like, I don't know, how long is a piece of string? There can be so many things that come up, right? I was like, there can be so many things that come up. I think emotionally, you might be surprised about things that you learn about yourself in a threesome. I've definitely learned a lot about myself in kind of group sex situations. You might also be shocked sometimes at what you learn about yourself or what you learn about others. It can really change your worldview. Sometimes you might be like, oh, that's how you look during sex. That's how you feel. That's how you sound. I never considered that because it is different than watching it on a screen. So emotionally, there can be so much that comes up around knowing ourselves, around knowing other people, about expanding, moving away from erotocentrism. So this assumption that we all think about and experience sexuality in the same way. There can be an expansiveness that comes up. And there can also be jealousies, insecurities, the things that we already talked about that come up as well, of course. And what I would say is that, if that is a first experience, take into account that it's a first experience and that the way you feel after that first experience might not be the way you always feel because context is also relevant here. And so I know I felt all sorts of different ways in group sex situations. And it's not always the same. And so don't expect, it's not a cookie cutter experience. Don't expect to have the same emotional experience every time. For example, you might be a couple who's had a lot of threesomes with other people, and then a new partner brings up a totally different dynamic that then surprises you both. And also we change through life in terms of our needs and our wants. And so just be open to the fact that what you experience the first time might not be what you experience the second time or the third time or the 10th time. Or maybe you decide you never want to try that again, and that's okay too.
I completely agree. When I think back to my first group experiences, and I think maybe this is true. I don't know if this is an age thing or this is just like an experience thing. It's hard. Those things overlap a lot. But the first times are also very vivid. I still to this day remember the very first time I was in like a group sex experience. There were two different experiences I think of as my very first times. And I like vividly could tell you every single detail about everything that happened those times to this day. And now that happens much more frequently, and sometimes I might even forget that it happened last week or something like that. And so I think the first experience might be, to Alex's point, very emotionally salient and stick with you and be in your head a little bit more. Just because it is such a new experience, can be very sensationally overwhelming, emotionally overwhelming, potentially sexually overwhelming. There's just like a lot happening, and if it's a new experience, I think that can rig up all kinds of emotions. And then add in everything else that we've talked about today of like potentially power dynamics, the context of it, if it's you as an individual or you with a partner or a group of people. There is just a lot of different parts to the emotional complexity that can come up across the range of emotions and feelings that you could have. And so I think it is important to take the time to process that after the fact. In the moment if you can. But I think sometimes if it just truly is your first experience with this, it might be something that you're processing for days, weeks, months, years after.
Yeah, and I'm just going to synthesize all of these things into basically one thing. All feelings are valid. So you're going to have feelings before, during, and after, and all of them are valid. That's part of the whole part about being a human is we have feelings and they all are valid. So there you go.
So, before we close, I want to ask each of you, what's the one thing you wish people understood before exploring intimacy with more than one person?
I think the one thing I would say is to go into it also try to prepare however you can. If you have the ability to, depending on the scenario or situation, think about what your boundaries might be, think about things that you might anticipate that you want to at least have thought about and try to do that. But I think especially if you're doing this with a partner or somebody else, have those conversations, but just kind of go into it with an open mind for your first time because there are lots of things that could come up and you might, like we've talked about, be prepared for them or not, but kind of just go in with an open mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think openness to new experience and first experiences is a part of this for sure. I'll briefly, just because I agree with Alex and Alan, sharing a bit about yourself is important. I actually, this is going to sound crazy, but I feel like my first threesome was actually super consensual, really clear, and it just happened. So I was in Alaska in my early 20s, back home from college for the holiday time, and I'm hanging out with two of my guy friends that I had not ever had penetrative encounters with before. And we were just having a good time at my house. And they were like, "What are your thoughts on us all having sex together?" And I was like, I love this idea. So we had barriers because I had some already. We had a discussion. These are two guys. They didn't want to touch each other, but they were really interested in us doing these activities specifically. Like we all agreed. We had a great time. We cuddled afterwards. We napped for a bit, and then they left, and it was fantastic. And I feel like we did a pretty good job discussing boundaries, and it was all our first time for this, including our first time with the three of us. None of us had done any of this together. And I guess what I would say is being open and curious and communicative, and it was fun. It was fun. So don't forget that pleasure is a big part of sexual health, and it was pleasureful. Alex, final thought.
I love that. I also have had really positive experiences, so maybe I'm biased on a range. But if I think about one thing that I would want people to know is be willing to be radically honest with yourself about what you want, what your boundaries are, what you need, and also vulnerable. Because I think if you are like performing in air quotes, you're not going to have a good time. Like the more performative you are in sex, I think the less of a good time you're going to have. And as a sex therapist, I see this all the time. The more we get kind of wrapped up in like, what should I look like? What does my body need to look like? What do I look like in this angle or that angle? If we get wrapped up in like our own kind of maybe queer phobia or whatever it is that's coming up for us, we're not going to have a good time. And so being able to be radically honest with ourselves about where we're at, what are we comfortable with, and then being really vulnerable with each other around our needs and our desires, I think then it's much more likely that we're going to have a good time because we're going into it kind of fully awake and aware. But if we're like unsure or if we feel coerced or pushed by other people, it's probably not a good idea, I would say. And that's part of the radical honesty. And I say that because sometimes I also see couples where one person really wants to have that experience and the other person is not ready for it. And sometimes it can be hard for the person who's ready to hear that the other person is not ready. But honestly, if everybody is not ready to some degree, it's probably not going to be the best experience. But if people, it's like, I love that example, Markie. I feel the same. My first time was like in a dark room at a bi party in Amsterdam with strangers. And then the party continued on at one of the people's houses. But there was a lot of honesty and openness, and that made it fun and incredibly intimate, even though it was with strangers. There was just so much clarity. And so don't be afraid to be vulnerable, to be honest. And even if there is a little part of you inside that wants to kind of hide, listen to it, right? And honor that. And if that part is not ready, maybe you're not ready to have this experience, and that is information. Or maybe that part needs a little bit of support. Or maybe you feel absolutely ready to go into this adventure. But listen to yourself first rather than other people, if that makes sense. Don't be afraid to listen to yourself and not just listen to other people. Because I think if you're kind of feeling swept along, you might not have as much fun. And so if you need to like take a break, go to the bathroom and think about it because it's happening in that moment, do that. Take a little break, go to the bathroom and check in with yourself. Am I doing what I want to be doing? Do I need to communicate something? let's just be real honest with ourselves in those moments.
Thank you very much. So openness, honesty, and have fun.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation. I myself have also taken away a lot from it. So I thank all of you for joining me for this conversation.
Thank
you so much.
Yes,
Thank
thanks
you.
for having me.
Thank you for this lovely threesome. It was so fun. Actually, foursome with our host.
You're listening to Sexual Encounters, the very first time. Want to share a story with us? DM us on Let's Talk First, or you can email sexualencounterstheveryfirst@gmail.com. Thank you for listening.